remember the exact angle of the light the night I found out. It came through the blinds in a thin, accusatory strip and cut across Daniel's face as he slept on his back, mouth open, like a careless confession. There was a lipstick stain at the edge of his collar. A small, ridiculous thing that should have been easy to dismiss. Instead, it felt like a bell. Clear, metallic, impossible to ignore. My name is Elena Markey. I was 29 then, a hospital nurse with steady hands and a habit of cataloging small obsessions. The way a patient's pulse fluttered before a seizure, how some people smelled like pennies when they were nervous, the rhythm of a lie as it recurred until it became believable even to its teller. I loved Daniel. Or I loved the version of us we'd rehearsed in private. Lazy Sunday breakfasts, his laugh when I burned the eggs, his hand always warm in the crook of my waist. We had been living together a year, everything domestic and tidy and promising, until the light showed me he had been rehearsing another life behind my back. At first I tried the usual things. Denial like anesthesia, anger like a fever. I asked and he lied, clumsy at it, as someone does when they believe themselves entitled to preserve a narrative. He said it was nothing, a stupid mistake. A mistake stretched thin into an apology that wouldn't sit on my skin. I wanted to punish him then, to make him taste the uncertainty he'd given me. But something wiser or colder had already begun to grow inside me. The desire not just to punish, but to prove, to dismantle the idea of him as he had shown himself to the world. Revenge in movies is a clean, gleaming thing. A montage, a final shot of someone walking away. Real retribution is more intimate. It creeps like ivy along the brickwork of a life. It takes months to seed and root. I didn't want fireworks. I wanted ruin that was quiet, precise, and irreversible in its own way. I wanted him to recognize, every time he looked in the mirror, that the man reflected there had been stripped of the narrative he had built on my back. I wanted to win. I began to map him the way I mapped my patients' charts. Daniel's day had patterns. The gym at 6, his lunch at the cafe on Meridian, his online persona. A careful mosaic of selfies, jokes, and half-baked insights posted at 11 p.m. He was proud of his cleanliness, his punctuality, his predictable kindnesses. He was proud of being charming. Those things were hinges I could lever open. First I collected evidence. Not because I needed more proof of betrayal, the lipstick had been enough, but because proof is the language of fire that spreads logically, leaving no room for the messy ambiguities of feelings. I took screenshots of messages he left open on his laptop when he forgot to lock it. I made copies of receipts. I saved photos from the accounts he never thought I knew about. I scrubbed my own fingerprints out of certain corners, not to conceal, but to ensure that what I had belonged to me, a ledger of his duplicity, neat and undeniable. Then I began to play small games that would set the stage. I started laughing at his jokes in new ways, the way you rehearse the frequency of a bell before you ring it. I would text him in the evenings as if I belonged to another life. A life of a woman who started to glow and forget the shape of compromise. He noticed. He tightened. It was the first delicious fracture. I am not the sort to shout. I am the kind of person who understands the map of someone's private shame and can plant a flag in it so tenderly he will eventually trip on it. My plan had rules. No physical harm, no illegal sabotage, no public smears that could be construed as lies. I wasn't interested in the kind of revenge that could be used against me in court or the press. I wanted truth to fold over him like a second skin. Let him suffocate under what he had made. Once, after a dinner party where Daniel wore his casual charm as armor, I let slip the wrong name at the wrong moment. It was a small thing, a coffee stain of a mistake, but his expression when he realized I'd known more than he had supposed was a map of panic. From then on, he began to second-guess himself. He began to craft his words like a man stepping on glass. The more he feared being found out, the more mistakes he made. The tiger of suspicion I had awakened now hunted him through his own ego. The real work was to show him where his infidelity changed value, everywhere it touched. He had a sister, Claire, who adored him and looked at me like a tentative stamp of acceptance. He had a job with a boss who believed in his initiative and his dependability. The community where he and I lived was small. People knew each other's dogs, the names of their children, who lent what and when. Small communities are tinder for reputation. A reputation that smells of deceit dies quickly. So I began to establish a separate life, carefully and legally. A name on a new mailing list, a new email, a presence on a forum where I knew a mutual acquaintance would linger. I volunteered at the local public library's outreach program. An unremarkable, benign choice that would later give me an alibi and a witness bank of sorts. I made friends who were intermittently blunt and who had the sort of wide networks that gossip gravitates to like moths to porchlight. I learned to move through social circles with the lightness of someone whose moral center is not owed to a partner's brand of truth. But the weapon I sharpened most was narrative. Stories are currency. If you can craft one, authentic or not, told convincingly enough, people will trade their perceptions for it. I did not have to lie. I only had to highlight inconsistencies, to present facts in context until he looked indecent. I filed his truth against the porch of public perception until it could not stand on its own. I wrote an essay, a piece of breathless, careful recollection, about personal betrayal, about the slow erosion of trust. It was fiction, loosely based, but with a ring of veracity that made it smell like confession. I posted it on a small but reputable blog known for literary essays. The piece was the kind of thing people shared. Intimate, articulate, edging toward the universal. Readers wrote comments about empathy, about the politics of small acts that become big betrayals. It didn't mention Daniel by name. It didn't need to. But it primed the air so that when I began to reveal specifics, people were ready to listen. The crucial pivot came when I began to let events fall into place without clutching them. Daniel's co-workers started to notice him checking his phone too often. His boss asked if everything was all right when he missed a deadline. I set up small conversations in places where echoes would amplify. I would sit in the cafe where his colleagues took meetings and talk, loudly and tenderly, about fidelity and the shards it leaves. These were not confessions. They were testimonials to the kind of woman who would not tolerate being a prop. They were breadcrumbs, laid for a pack. And because I believed in evidence that stung, I arranged for him to find his own receipts at the flattening point of public exposure. I did not plant them. I simply made his choices visible. A chain of texts, printed and bound, arrived at Claire's house with a short, elegant cover letter. For your eyes only. E. Inside, sentences cut through the sugar of a brother's reputation. The same ledger went to his boss with professional, unemotional phrasing. There appears to be a conflict of interest with someone on the accounting team. Please review attached. I watched from the window as reality collapsed on him like a roof collapse. Inevitable, structural, utterly indifferent. He called me the first time, voice small and animal. Elena, he said, and his name was a pleading. I listened. I let the silence between sentences do the work I had done with my hands. He accused, then apologized, then tried to bargain. I heard his voice thrumming with shame, the way a struck bell hums when you touch it. He wanted me back. He wanted the narrative where he was forgiven and restored. I wanted him to understand the exact shape of what he had done and the consequences he had invited. The worst for him was not being alone. It was being watched as he unmade himself. Claire was furious. She had always tolerated Daniel's petty selfishness but not calculated cruelty. His boss, a woman who had once praised his leadership, was cold as a ledger. The company did an internal review. Gossip undercut his reliability. He defended himself in meetings and felt the eyes that measured him differently. I had won not through dramatic violence but by changing the currency of his world. His truth would no longer be taken for granted. Sometimes at night, I would imagine him lying awake, the memory of my name a stitch in his palm. I wanted him to remember my face as he scrubbed it from sheets he had never stained with his best intentions. But revenge, even when it succeeds, rarely resolves the emptiness it expects to fill. The more I saw him unravel, the more my own isolation pressed in. I had let myself become colder, almost clinical. I had to check the reasoning. Was I doing this to hurt him, or to protect myself? The answer was both. There is a thin line between vengeance as retribution and vengeance as a defensive geometry. My victory, when it came, was quieter than I imagined. It was not an explosion. It was the subtle reallocation of dignity. Claire read me a message 1 week later. You did the right thing. Thank you. That was the moment the winter thinned. A colleague of his called to ask why he had resigned. I did not answer. He gave up the job that had been a steady scaffolding for his life, and with it, the community that had once bolstered him. He moved out the way people move out of narratives. Messy, hasty, leaving behind the parts that mattered to the story only when they were forced to. In the months that followed, I rebuilt. The apartment felt too big at first, like a body missing a habit. I took long walks and began to write. The only honest use for the ledger of my experience. I taught a free workshop at the library about emotional boundaries. Not to preach revenge, but to give people language for when the ground shifts. People came with polite curiosity and left with strategies for safety, for choices. It felt like repair. But victory brought its own moral calculus. In the steam of a shower, I would sometimes think of Daniel's face, the way it had gone slack when he realized his world had shifted. There was triumph, yes, but also a knowledge that I had used what I was good at in a way that left no room for tenderness. I had learned to be ruthless with words and very careful with facts. I had made his life smaller because his life had been made small by his choices. There is a symmetry in that. It is not the same as justice, but it is almost as exact. Later, months after he left, I ran into him by accident at a farmer's market. He stood by a stall of apples, hands in his coat pockets, his hair too long, like someone hiding. We paused like strangers who shared a familiar landmark. He looked at me with an expression I would now recognize anywhere. Not quite shame, not quite apology, more like the haunted face of someone who had learned his lesson too late. "Elena," he said, and the name was careful, trying not to ask too much. "Daniel," I answered. There was no venom in my tone. It had been spent. I had used it all, and what remained was the calm of someone who has rehearsed grief and found a way to stand in its rubble. He asked how I was. I told him truthfully. I was okay. Not whole in the naive sense, but knit with new threads. I was teaching, writing, learning how to sleep again without rehearsing betrayals. He listened, and in his listening there was an acknowledgement, the sort you give when you finally understand that a mirror you thought was for reflection was really for showing other people who you are. "I'm sorry," he said eventually, "because sometimes apologies are all people will ever be able to give." I accepted it in the manner of someone who had grown wise from bruises. With a small nod, a closed gesture that did not invite more. After he left, I walked to the edge of the river and watched the water pull at the city's reflection. The current did not care about names or confessions. It only carried what it was given. I had given it a part of myself to be carried away. Anger, cunning, a small cruel artistry. And in exchange it gave me perspective. Revenge had been a language I learned and then spoke until I tired of it. In the telling afterward, in the long afternoons where nothing happened, I found the softer verbs of living. To mend, to teach, to trust again in small doses. People sometimes ask me if revenge was sweet. I used to say it was. Now I say something more complicated. It was necessary, given the stakes, and it taught me the shape of my own limits. It taught me that I could build an edifice of consequence from the stone of honesty. I learned to recognize the point where righteous anger tips into cruelty and to choose, deliberately, the edge I wanted to stand on. There is a moral math to these things that cannot be solved in absolutes. Daniel's choices led to his unraveling. My choices led to my own remaking. Neither of us emerged pristine. He learned painfully that a life built on borrowed faith collapses when you stop paying attention to its foundation. I learned that victory can be quiet and that winning does not always fill the hollowness that betrayal carves. On the anniversary of the day I found the lipstick, I burned the ledger. Not the physical pages, but the habit of checking his accounts, of holding proof like a shield that would dim and dull my future. I made tea, sat near the window where the light had once betrayed him, and watched the smoke taut and thin. The room filled with an acrid honesty and, for the first time in a long while, something like peace. The story I tell now is not a manual or a manifesto. It is a confession and a warning. When people betray you, you do not have to dissolve into fury. You can recalibrate the world so that truth matters again. You can make the cost of duplicity visible without becoming the thing you despise. If you are careful, if you keep the moral edges blunt and the harm contained to what is necessary, then you can take your life back and arrange it like a room where sunlight sits at the center. And sometimes when night falls and the apartment hums with the ordinary machinery of living, I hear a laugh in my own head. Daniel's laugh, once so easy, now remembered like a tune I used to hum. It is tempered by the memory of what I lost, and what I gained. I am stronger, and perhaps a little colder, but I am whole in the way that matters. My life is no longer someone else's script. I won. Not with a final dramatic stroke, but with 1,000 small acts of insistence that truth should be seen and accounted for. The victory was not his collapse alone. It was my standing up afterward, teaching and writing and making room in my life for hands that would not be quick to betray. Fidelity, I discovered, is not only a contract between lovers. It is a standard of how you carry yourself in the world. I reclaimed that standard, and in doing so, I reclaimed myself. It started with an email. Subject line: "You think you know the truth." No name. No signature. Just a link, a short one, generated to look harmless. Of course I didn't click it. I'm not stupid. But that small single sentence lodged in me like glass. For months after Daniel vanished from my life, I'd been fine. Functional, productive, even proud. I was teaching, writing, filling my days with structure. Yet the email reminded me that stories never end where you want them to. They circle back, like predators that lost their scent but found it again. That night, I couldn't sleep. The air felt too thick. I sat by the window, the same window where I'd once burned my ledger, and watched the city lights blink in indifferent rhythm. Someone out there knew something. Or thought they did. The next morning, a man showed up after my lecture. Tall, lean, that precise kind of corporate polish that always made me uneasy. "Miss Markey?" he said, voice neutral. "I'm Detective Wilkes, Homicide Division." The word homicide clanged in my chest like a fire alarm. He was polite. Too polite, as he explained. Daniel had been found dead 3 nights ago in his apartment. Overdose, possibly suicide, though they weren't ruling anything out. He mentioned my name because Daniel's sister had told them about me. "We're just doing background checks," Wilkes said. "You were close once." Were. The word sat heavily between us. I remember sitting still while the world folded inward. Suicide. I had imagined his ruin 1,000 ways. Humiliation, loneliness, regret, but never this. I had wanted him broken, not gone. Dead men don't learn. Dead men don't understand the architecture of pain you built for them. Wilkes asked standard questions. When had I last spoken to Daniel? Did he ever show signs of depression? Did I know if he used substances? I answered carefully, truthfully. But underneath, something coiled. Was this my fault? After he left, I sat in silence, my mind replaying the last time I saw Daniel. At the market, quiet, fragile. I'd mistaken that fragility for humility. Maybe it had been despair. For the next few weeks, I moved like a ghost. Everyone around me, colleagues, students, even strangers, seemed too loud, too alive. I avoided mirrors. I stopped writing. The revenge that once gave me clarity now tasted like rust. And then Claire called. Her voice was tight, exhausted. "You ruined him," she said flatly. "You didn't have to destroy his whole life." I didn't defend myself. What could I say? That I'd only wanted truth? That he'd earned it? That I'd drawn boundaries around my cruelty like fences, thinking it would keep me moral? Her silence after my pause was worse than her accusation. Then she added, quieter, "You think you won. But he wasn't the only one who lost." That sentence haunted me. Because she was right. I had lost too, though in ways harder to name. My empathy, my softness, my ability to believe in redemption. All those things had burned with my ledger that night. Months passed. The police ruled Daniel's death a suicide. A mix of alcohol and sleeping pills. No foul play. No note. I was free, technically. But guilt has its own jurisdiction, and I lived under its law. One day, a student stayed behind after class. Her name was Marin, 19, too sharp for her age. She asked if I believed people could change, really change, after they'd done something unforgivable. I told her what I thought was the truth. Maybe not completely. But we can choose what we do with the aftermath. She smiled, sad and knowing. "I hope you believe that for yourself too." It hit me harder than I expected. That night, I went back to my old notes, my private journals, and reread everything. The planning, the rationalizations, the cold precision. I wanted to see where the line had blurred. Somewhere between justice and cruelty, I'd stopped being a victim and become something else. Someone else. The next morning, I visited Claire. She didn't expect me. Her eyes hardened at first, then softened, maybe out of fatigue. She looked older. "I didn't come to defend myself," I said. "I came because I think you deserve to hear me say it. I went too far." Her hands trembled slightly. "You think saying that fixes it?" "No," I said. "But maybe it keeps us from living inside his ghost forever." We talked for hours. About Daniel. About the things people do out of fear, pride, hunger for control. By the end, she wasn't forgiving me, but she wasn't hating me either. There was space, not peace but space. Enough to breathe. That night, I dreamt of Daniel again, not as he'd been in life, but standing in water up to his chest, looking at me with something unreadable. Not accusation. Not forgiveness. Just recognition. As if to say, now you understand. When I woke, I finally did. Revenge is never just about the other person. It's about the parts of yourself you exile to make it possible. You think you can bring those parts back when it's over, but you can't. They come back altered, heavier, quieter, watching you from corners of your own mind. So I began to write again. Not essays, not vengeance disguised as art, but truth. A book, maybe. Something about what happens when justice turns into obsession, when a wound starts believing it's a weapon. I wrote Daniel's name once, then deleted it. He wasn't the story anymore. I was. And maybe finally that was what winning really meant. Not triumph, not dominance, but ownership. Owning what I'd done. Owning who I'd become. Owning the silence that followed every victory too sharp to celebrate. The first review of my book came out on a rainy Thursday. It wasn't a bestseller, not yet, but the blog that featured it had reach. The article was titled, "The Confession Disguised as Fiction." Who is Elena Markey really writing about? I remember my hands trembling slightly as I read it. The reviewer wasn't entirely wrong. The book, Anatomy of Betrayal, was a carefully written autopsy of revenge. The psychology, the precision, the hunger for balance. I had called it fiction. But it wasn't fiction enough. In interviews, I described it as therapeutic realism. I'd said, writers process the unspoken. That's our work. But somewhere, somehow, a reader had recognized Daniel in the pages. His habits, his charm, even the small detail about the gym at 6. The story I thought I'd disguised was bleeding through its disguise. By the following week, another article appeared, this time from a journalist named Eli Carter, a name I would come to both dread and admire. The headline was worse. Did the author who wrote about psychological revenge drive a man to suicide? I stared at the words until they blurred. He had done his homework. He had found Daniel's obituary, pieced together fragments of public record, even dug through old social media posts, enough to create a thread of suspicion that felt like déjà vu. His article didn't accuse me outright. It implied. That's always more dangerous. Implication spreads faster than evidence. By the weekend, the comments section had turned into a swarm, half defending me, half dissecting my morality like I was a specimen. She's brilliant. She's a sociopath. She's lying. She's brave. The symmetry of it all was poetic, in a cruel way. I had spent years dismantling Daniel's narrative. Now someone was dismantling mine. And the worst part? I understood exactly how to do it, and I could see step by step that Eli was doing it right. When he requested an interview, I almost declined. But curiosity is a kind of arrogance, and I've never been immune to either. We met at a small cafe downtown, one of those places where the air smells of burnt espresso and recycled ambition. He was younger than I expected. Late 30s, maybe, sharp eyes, deliberate movements. A journalist who knew silence was his best weapon. "Thank you for meeting me," he said, smiling with the right amount of warmth to disarm. "I'm not afraid of questions," I replied. "I just hope you're not afraid of answers." He liked that. I could tell. For the first half hour, we danced, professional, cautious. He asked about the book, the themes of power, the concept of controlled revenge. I spoke about psychology, about human behavior, about fiction as therapy. Then, he leaned forward, voice lower. Was Daniel his real name? I didn't answer. Not because I was hiding, but because silence once again said more. He studied me like a riddle he didn't want to solve too soon. "You write with such precision," he said. "Every emotional beat feels observed, lived. It's hard to believe it's just imagination." "That's what makes it good," I said calmly. He smiled again, but this time there was a question in it. The public loves honesty. Even brutal honesty. If this book is based on real events, people will forgive you faster than they forgive lies. "I'm not asking for forgiveness," I said. "I'm asking for understanding. There's a difference." He nodded, but I saw the hunger behind his professionalism. The journalist's lust for a headline that could end careers and make his name shine. When we left, he shook my hand. His grip was steady, almost gentle. But his eyes told me something else. He wasn't done. Not even close. The following weeks became a study in pressure. Online, debates about me raged like religion. My publisher told me to ignore it. Ride the wave. Controversy sells, she said. But I knew better. Controversy corrodes. It starts as buzz and ends as blood. Then one night, I came home to find a letter slid under my door. No address, no envelope. Just a single sheet. Typed. Not handwritten. You taught him how to hate himself. No signature. I felt that sentence like a pulse under my ribs. The room seemed smaller. The shadows had weight. Someone was watching me, or wanted me to think they were. That night I dreamed again. Daniel standing at the same river, but now the water was red. When I woke, the taste of guilt was raw in my mouth. I told myself it was just internet drama made flesh, trolls, fans, obsessives. But deep down, I knew Eli had stirred something older, darker, patient. 2 days later he called. I want to show you something, he said. Not as a journalist. As a person. Against better judgment, I agreed. We met at his office, cluttered with printouts, scribbled notes, newspaper clippings. On the wall, pinned under thumbtacks, was a photograph. Daniel. Alive. Smiling, from a company event. Next to it, a map. My city. Red pins marking places from my book. Fictional places. Only they weren't fictional at all. They were real. Every one of them. How did you? He interrupted. You changed the names, but not the coordinates. Then he turned to me, voice quiet. Why? I had no answer. Maybe part of me wanted to be found. Maybe the book wasn't just a confession. Maybe it was a test, a dare to the universe to see if I could still be seen for what I'd done and survive it. Tell me the truth, Eli said softly. Was he your revenge? I looked at him and, for the first time in years, felt the tremor of genuine fear. Not of him but of myself. Of what I might say if I stopped pretending. Finally I said, he was my lesson. I just didn't know I was his. He stared, then exhaled. You realize people will think you killed him. I smiled faintly. They already do. And that's the point. Belief is just a better disguise than denial. He didn't publish that line. But I saw it in his eyes, the calculation, the conflict. He wasn't sure if I was confessing or performing. Maybe both. A month later, the story went viral again. Author of revenge novel connected to real-life suicide. Coincidence or confession? My publisher dropped me. Bookstores pulled the title. And yet, it sold more copies than ever. That's the paradox of infamy. People love what they're supposed to hate. Through it all, Eli kept visiting. First as a journalist, then as something else, an uneasy ally. Maybe even a witness to my unraveling. He'd ask questions no one else dared. Do you regret it? Sometimes I'd answer honestly. No. Other times, every day. He told me once, you're the most self-aware monster I've ever met. I said, then maybe I'm not a monster. Just honest. One night, after too much wine and too little restraint, I told him something I hadn't told anyone. The worst part isn't what I did to him. It's what it did to me. I used to love helping people. Now when I see pain I measure it. He didn't flinch. Then maybe it's time to stop measuring. He leaned closer. For a moment, I thought he'd kiss me. But he didn't. He whispered. Write the second book. The real one. The one that hurts you this time. So I did. And that's where it began again. Not the revenge, but the reckoning. I thought writing the second book would be catharsis. A scalpel, cleaner this time, aimed inward. I told myself I would be meticulous. No theatrics, no clever disguises, only the cold architecture of truth. I would name the parts of myself that had become tools and set them on the table to be examined. I told myself this would heal me. So I wrote. I wrote in the small hours, the city's distant hum, a lullaby for people who sleep while others confess. My apartment smelled of coffee and old paper. Pages accumulated, long, ugly things at first, then sentences that shone, then paragraphs that made me wince. I called the manuscript The Mirror Effect, the working title a blunt reference to the way I had been both observer and perpetrator. I typed until my fingers ached and then typed more. When I sent the first draft to my editor, a freelance woman named June who'd agreed to work with me despite the backlash, I felt a lightness I hadn't felt in months. June responded quickly, warm and professional. "This is brave," she wrote. "Raw, precise. We'll polish, of course, but the spine is there." She returned the file with tracked changes. I opened it late, after a lecture, with the computer balanced on my knees. The edits began as usual. Tightening, pruning, suggesting clarifications. Then, halfway through chapter 4, my stomach dropped. A paragraph I knew I had cut reappeared in a new form. Not a line I'd forgotten, but a memory I had never written, a small scene grotesquely intimate, of Daniel standing over a bathroom sink, humming a song his sister had once loved. A song Claire had taught me when we were younger, lullaby words Claire had never mentioned in public. The scene was detailed. The cadence of his humming, the abrasion of his jaw when he tried to smile. I did not remember writing this. I had never known that detail about the song. I highlighted the passage and scrolled up. There were more additions, subtle at first, a tiny aside here, an extra sentence there. Then whole paragraphs that described moments I'd only thought privately, things I hadn't told anyone. Things no one could have known. I called June. Her voice was immediately calm, the kind of professionalism that pretends the world is still orderly. "We thought these fragments fit the emotional arc," she said. "They add texture." "Who suggested them?" I asked. There was a pause. "A colleague. Sam. He's a developmental editor. He's very good with psychological beats." I asked for Sam's email and pinged him. No reply that night. I told myself to trust the process. Editors add color. That's their craft. Still, the hair on my arms prickled. Over the next week, the edits multiplied. Sentences that I had deleted came back with a confidence I had never lent them. The manuscript began to feel less like my confession, and more like someone else's diary stitched into mine. I started to sleep badly, waking to the impression that someone had been in my apartment. The lock on the door still clicked the same, but I began double-locking it and piling books against the frame at night like a child warding off shadows. One afternoon, I found a hard copy of Chapter 9 waiting on my kitchen table. It was in my own font, printed from a printer that matched mine, left neatly where anyone could see it through the window. No note, no return address, just paper, heavy with other people's breath. My phone buzzed. An unfamiliar number. A message. "We're helping you tell the truth, Elena." I stared until the letters doubled. Who syndicated my honesty like that? Who decided what truth I could keep? I called Eli. He picked up on the second ring, voice low. "I saw a copy at the cafe," he said without preamble. It looked more personal than the book. "Did you touch it?" I asked. No, his tone was careful. "But I think—" He stopped. "Be careful." His warning did nothing for my sense of reality. It amplified the fracture. I started combing the apartment for evidence. For signs of an intruder, for prints, for anything. I found nothing. The only trace was the paper itself. Words that I had not consented to wearing like a second skin. I met June in person. She looked tired, her mascara bridging small rivers under her eyes. "We have an agent who's interested," she said, and the world tilted oddly. "They think the book could be big if we lean into the personal elements." "Who is this agent?" I asked. She hesitated, then said a name I'd heard only once before. A literary figure who liked scandals served as art. "They want authenticity," she said. I felt the old gears shift. The machinery of exposure whirred. What was uncanny was not that people wanted the raw truth. It was that they seemed to have access to parts of that truth before I'd fully claimed them. It felt like a theft of my interior life. Then, the edit started to accuse. I opened chapter 12 and froze. A paragraph described a night I had buried in my memory. The night Daniel had not come home after work and Claire had called me frantic. I had been jagged then, full of tactics and less of tenderness. The paragraph said something I had never admitted even to myself, that I had wanted him to hurt enough to understand. That line, "I wanted him to hurt enough to understand," was a confession I had never typed. But reading it on the page was like finding a fingerprint in a jar. Unmistakable, intimate, damning. I printed the chapter and held it under the cold kitchen light as if the act would reveal a watermark. I called Claire. She picked up after 3 rings. You shouldn't have published that line, she said immediately, voice raw. People are talking about. I didn't publish anything, I told her. Someone else added it. Silence on the other end. Then, who? I don't know. There are small evolutions in terror. First comes disbelief, then the compulsion to fix, then the acceptance that you are being watched. After acceptance comes strategy. I tried to reclaim control. I unplugged the router. I changed all my passwords and printed new drafts only to lock them in a closet. I began writing longhand in a notebook and thumb-typing to myself like a person who knows her voice matters more than her convenience. But the edits kept arriving. Digital files would show tracked changes that appeared when I opened them, as if someone had been there in the pauses between my keystrokes. Once, I left the laptop open on the dining table with the screen bright. I came back to find the cursor moving slightly, as if pushed by an invisible finger. The changes were tiny, a comma, a flourish, but they were clearly not mine. The turns of phrase had a rhythm I did not have. Sleep evaporated into a gray while. My lectures grew brittle. Students noticed my distance. June pleaded with me to stop fighting the process. We can't control everything, she said. Publishers will want buzz. Buzz had acquired a predatory tone. Buzz or bait. Each time a new line appeared in the manuscript, it seemed to be a probe, testing which parts of me could be pried open to public view. The more intimate the insertion, the more likely my world would fracture. Relationships strained, friendships splayed, work dissolved. It was a scalpel disguised as an editor. I began to suspect people. June, the publishing house, even Eli. I clung to evidence like a lighthouse. Timestamps, logs, the faint metadata embedded in files. Once, staring at raw code under a file's properties, I found a trace, an IP address, a flake of digital dust leading back to an office block downtown. The address belonged to a small PR firm that specialized in creating scandals that sold books. The same firm I'd heard June mention once in a conversation about marketing leverage. I went to the firm. No one there had heard of me. They smiled with the professional blandness of people who manufacture stories for a living. They had no idea. The trace was a dead end, like the red pins on Eli's map, promising geography but delivering nowhere. And then, in the middle of an ordinary Tuesday, I received an envelope without a stamp. Inside, a single sheet with one sentence. You asked to be seen. My hands shook so badly I had to grip the edge of the table. Who had arranged for my privacy to be violated in the name of an art I barely recognized anymore? Who had decided to make my truth public property? I sat down, the paper splayed like a palm. For a moment, I considered burning it. The thought felt childish. I had tried to erase things before. The ledger's ash had not been enough to stop the current. I opened my notebook and wrote one sentence by hand. If you are out there, stop. Then in the margins, the handwriting that crept up on me in dreams, neat, calm, deliberate, answered in my head, or what? That question lodged itself like a splinter. The edits, the anonymous letters, the printed chapters on my table. They were less a plot device and more an interrogation. Whoever controlled the narrative had power to remake me. To salvage my life I would have to step into a different role. Not the confessor, not the revenge architect, but the hunted. So I did the only thing left. I stopped apologizing and began to listen. I traced the edits back where I could, pieced together who benefited from my ruin and who did not. I learned the languages of servers and contracts, of PR firms and metadata. I read the patterns in people's eyes when they thought they had power over me. I learned that witnesses often crave spectacle more than truth. On the night I finally found the man who had been submitting revisions in my name, not in person, but through a thread of a forum where editors bragged about engineered virality, I did not feel triumph. I felt the thin, cold clarity of someone who finally understood the rules of a game she had been made to play. He called himself Ren. He posted pictures of books he'd helped break into bestsellers, anecdotes about the ethics of narrative. His avatar was a small bird. His messages were clinical. We accelerate arcs, he wrote. We make private truth public when it sells. I printed his posts and slid them into a folder. It was evidence, sure, but what I wanted, beneath professional accountability, was an answer to a more personal question. Why me? Why had I been chosen to be both spectacle and subject? That night, the city sounded different. The air felt taut, as if a storm were pressing just beyond the horizon. I locked my door as always, and slid the printed posts into a drawer. The edit stopped then for a day, then 2. I let myself believe it might be over. But the silence was not relief. It was a hush that meant something else. The predator was listening, waiting for me to lower my guard. And when it came back, as it always did like a tide, I realized the real horror was not that someone else could write me for me. The real horror was that I had, in some ways, taught them how. They say every story has 2 endings. The one you write, and the one that writes you. I used to think that was poetic nonsense, something authors told themselves to romanticize chaos. But now I know better. Because the ending that wrote me started with a knock. It was almost midnight. The city outside was silent in that way it gets when even the wind seems to hold its breath. 3 knocks. Slow. Deliberate. I froze. For a moment, I considered pretending not to be home. But the knocks came again. Patient this time, as if the person on the other side already knew I would open. I did. The man in the doorway was exactly as I had imagined Ren. Mid-40s, pale, tidy in that way people are when they spend too much time in front of screens. He smiled. Small. Polite. Clinical. "Miss Maki," he said. "I thought it was time we spoke." I should have screamed. Or slammed the door. Instead, I stepped aside. Curiosity, my oldest sin, invited him in. He walked around my apartment like someone inspecting a property he already owned. His gaze lingered on the shelves, the papers, the notebooks. "You keep your drafts close," he said. "I respect that." "You've been inside my files," I said. He nodded, almost proud. "You gave permission." "I never." "You published," he interrupted gently. "Once you gave the story to the world, you opened the door. I just walked through it." The calm in his voice was more terrifying than any threat. He wasn't angry, or unhinged. He was reasonable. The kind of person who could justify anything. "Why me?" I asked. "Because you built the perfect narrative," he said. "A woman wronged, a man destroyed, guilt, retribution. It's archetypal. It sells itself. You made it real. I made it marketable." I laughed then, bitterly. "You turned my confession into a product." He smiled. "You did that long before I came along." He moved closer, and for a moment, the light caught his eyes. Dark, reflective. "The thing about truth," he said softly, "is that people don't want it. They want the performance of truth. You're very good at that, Elena." I felt my pulse quicken. "You think you know me?" He tilted his head. "I don't think. I read you." Then he reached into his coat and placed a flash drive on the table. "Your real manuscript," he said. "Unedited. Untouched. Everything you deleted, everything you thought you hid, it's all here. Metadata doesn't forget." I stared at it. The drive glinted under the lamp like a shard of ice. "What do you want?" "An ending," he said. "One that makes sense. For both of us." And then he left, as quietly as he had arrived. 4 days, I didn't touch the drive. It sat there, small and silent, like a heart that refused to beat. But eventually, temptation won. I plugged it in. The folder inside was labeled Truth and Final. I opened it, expecting my old drafts. Instead, I found a single document titled Confession.docs. I clicked. The first line read, "I didn't mean to kill him." My hands went cold. Line after line unfolded. Words written in my style, my rhythm, my syntax. It was me. But it wasn't. The confession described a night I couldn't remember. Daniel, pills, a confrontation, a shove, his head striking marble. Then the panic, the cleanup, the silence. It was perfect. Too perfect. So perfect it scared me. For a moment, I actually questioned myself. Memory is fragile. Guilt is corrosive. Had I done something I'd buried so deep it rewrote itself as vengeance instead of violence? The human mind is capable of infinite tricks when it wants to protect itself. I closed the file. I unplugged the drive. I sat in the dark, breathing shallow, heart slamming against the ribs of reality. Eli called me the next morning. His voice was tight. "You need to see this," he said. He sent me a link. An anonymous blog had published excerpts of Confession.docs. Word for word. Under my name. The article claimed it was a leaked true account of Daniel's death, that my novels had been coded confessions all along. Within hours, it went viral. My inbox filled with threats, pity, fascination. Strangers dissected my psyche, my motives, my sickness. The police called again. I gave them the same answers I'd given before. This time, I wasn't sure if they believed me. Neither was I. That night, I found another envelope under my door. Inside, a single Polaroid. It was me, sitting at my desk, writing, hair pulled back, a look of focus on my face. Taken from outside the window. On the back, in careful handwriting. You wanted truth. Now you have it. I burned it. Watched the edges curl, the image blacken. But the smoke didn't feel like cleansing this time. It felt like admission. Sleep became a battlefield. My dreams turned crowded. Daniel, Ren, Eli, all speaking in overlapping whispers. You built this. You fed it. You wanted to be seen. You didn't just write revenge. You lived it. You killed him. I started writing again, feverishly, trying to drown the voices. Each word felt like blood on the keys. Then one night, I looked up from my desk and saw my reflection in the dark window. Only, it wasn't me. She looked like me, yes. Same eyes, same mouth, but calmer. Smiling. She mouthed something I couldn't hear, and pressed her hand against the glass. I did the same. For a moment, the temperature dropped, and the glass fogged between us. When it cleared, she was gone. But her words lingered, written in the condensation. You are both of us. The next morning, I deleted every file. The book, the drafts, the edits, everything. I unplugged the router, smashed the hard drive, threw the shards into the river. And then I began again. Longhand. No names. No revenge. No past. Just ink, paper, breath. It's quieter now. The world has stopped watching. The voices have dimmed, most days. Sometimes I still see that smile in the window. Sometimes I hear typing when I'm alone. Maybe it's guilt. Maybe it's Ren. Maybe it's me. But I've learned something that terrifies and frees me in equal measure. Revenge doesn't end when you win. It ends when you finally understand you've been avenging yourself all along. And somewhere, deep in the circuits of an erased hard drive, a file waits to be opened again. Confession.docs. Last modified. Today. It's been a year since I destroyed everything. The files, the drafts, the mirrors. The interviews stopped, the headlines faded, the world moved on, as it always does. Even scandal has an expiration date. I live outside the city now. Small house. Fewer people. More sky. The mornings come quietly, a gray kind of peace that doesn't ask for forgiveness. I teach sometimes, but I don't write for anyone else anymore. The pen is still heavy in my hand, but it no longer feels like a weapon. People still ask about Daniel sometimes. Students who've read the first book whisper his name like it's a curse or a prayer. I tell them what's true, that love and cruelty often speak the same language, and that the difference between the two is only how long you listen before you act. Eli visited once. He'd quit journalism. Said the story had eaten more than it fed. We sat by the river, the same one that used to pull at the city's reflection. He asked if I'd ever found out who Ren really was. I told him I had theories. Maybe he was a real man, a ghost of the publishing machine. Maybe he was a program, feeding off controversy. Or maybe he was what my mind built when guilt needed a face. Eli smiled, sad and tired. Does it matter? He said. No, I answered. Not anymore. At night, I still dream. But they're different dreams now. Not of Daniel's death. Not of edits appearing on screens. Just water. Endless. Clean water. Sometimes I see him there. Not drowning, not blaming. Just standing quiet, looking at me the way he used to before the world turned sharp. I wake up and whisper the same words every morning. It's over. Not as a wish but as a fact. Because revenge, I've learned, isn't a cycle. It's a spiral. You think you're coming back to where you started. But every time, you're lower, deeper, smaller. Until you stop moving. Until silence feels like mercy. One afternoon, I walked into town to buy coffee. The barista, a young woman with a shy smile, asked for my name for the cup. Elena, I said. She wrote it, looked up, and said softly, "You look familiar. Have we met?" I smiled. No. I don't think so. And it was true. She hadn't met the woman I used to be. Neither had I. Now, I write again. But the stories are simple. About forgiveness, small joys, the taste of rain after years of ash. Sometimes when I finish a page, I leave a space at the bottom. Blank, untouched. For the ghosts. For what remains unsaid. For the part of me that will always live between the lines. And every time I close the notebook, I whisper one last thing. Not to Daniel, not to Ren. Not even to the version of me who wanted blood. Just to the silence itself. Thank you for staying when everyone else was gone.